Wedding night. The millionaire whispered, "Trust me," and her world changed forever. Hello everyone, before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It is quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support truly means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, let us return to our main characters. The ballroom was drowning in gold and white, chandeliers dripping like frozen fireworks above hundreds of polished faces. A $1,000 bottle of champagne had just been uncorked, and the orchestra played with such precision that every note seemed carved out of crystal. To the guests, this was a fairy tale wedding, perfect, untouchable. But beneath the lace veil, the bride's hands trembled. She was not marrying for love. She was marrying for survival. Her family's small business had been crushed under debt, and this marriage arranged, negotiated, and sealed with a contract was their only chance to stay afloat. On paper, she had become the wife of the most powerful heir in the city, a man whose name carried weight like iron. But in her heart, she felt like an actress thrust onto a stage she never auditioned for. The groom stood tall beside her, his tailored suit as sharp as his reputation. He had been known as cold, untouchable, a man who handled mergers with the same ease as cutting a glass of water. His face revealed nothing as the priest spoke the vows, nothing as the rings slid onto fingers. To the world, he was every inch the perfect groom. To her, he was a stranger, bound by ink and signatures. When the applause thundered and the veil was lifted, their eyes finally met. His were steady, deep, unreadable. And in that moment, as if sensing her fear, he leaned closer. His breath brushed her ear. Softly, so no one else could hear, he whispered two words that rattled through her chest. "Trust me." Her heart stuttered. Did he mean it as reassurance, or was it just another part of their performance? Before she could even process, his hand slipped around hers, strong and certain, and he guided her through the endless line of guests who cheered their union as if it were the purest kind of love. She smiled on cue, bowed politely, lifted her champagne glass with perfect grace. But inside, her thoughts raced. Why did those words feel heavier than the diamonds at her throat? Why did his voice sound less like an order and more like a promise? The night rolled on, an endless swirl of congratulations and photographs. Strangers told her she was lucky. They praised his success, his empire, his fortune. Yet not a single person noticed the way her fingers gripped the edge of her gown under the table, or how she stole glances at the man she was now legally tied to. The truth was simple and cruel. She was married to him, but she did not know him. And when the ballroom lights finally dimmed, when the last toast was made, and when the grand doors of the estate closed behind them, silence swallowed her whole. This was no longer the wedding. This was the night. Her pulse quickened as she followed him through the grand hall, past marble pillars and oil paintings that seemed to judge her with every step. She remembered the fine print of the contract. A marriage for appearances, a partnership without love, a bond meant only to satisfy family demands. But as he turned to face her, his expression unreadable in the golden glow, she wondered, what if those two words whispered at the altar were not part of the script? What if, "Trust me," was the beginning of something neither of them had planned? The grand doors of the mansion closed with a weighty echo, sealing her inside a world that was no longer hers. The laughter from the ballroom had faded, replaced by silence so thick it pressed against her chest. She followed him up the marble staircase, her heels tapping against the stone in a rhythm that betrayed her nerves. Every portrait that lined the walls seemed to glare at her, as if reminding her that she was only a guest wearing a crown that did not belong. When they entered the master suite, she realized how little she belonged here. The space was vast, too vast, with velvet curtains that brushed the floor and furniture carved from dark mahogany. She lowered her gaze, unsure of what was expected. The contract had promised appearances, but nothing more. He loosened his tie, watching her in silence. His expression was unreadable, a wall of calm authority. "You do not have to fear me," he said finally, his voice low but steady. "This marriage is an arrangement. We will respect each other's boundaries." Her shoulders eased slightly, though her heart still raced. She remembered the papers she had signed, the clauses and conditions. She was to remain his wife in name, smile when the cameras demanded it, and stand at his side during family events. Nothing more, nothing less. The rules of the contract were clear. They would live under the same roof but lead separate lives. She would not interfere with his business, and he would not ask about her private thoughts. There would be no love, no intimacy, only performance. Yet, as he poured a glass of water and set it before her, his smallest gesture carried weight. "You look pale. Sit down before you faint," he said, not unkindly. She obeyed, perching on the edge of the sofa, her gown flowing around her like liquid silk. In the quiet, she wondered if he saw through her fade. Did he know that she was terrified of disappointing him? Did he realize that she felt like a fragile pawn trapped in a chess game that had already been decided? The night passed slowly. He retreated to his study, leaving her alone in the suite. She removed her veil, placed it carefully on the dresser, and stared at her reflection in the mirror. The woman looking back seemed like a stranger, a wife by contract, not by love. She touched her bare neck where his breath had brushed earlier, remembering his words at the altar. "Trust me." The sound of it still lingered, haunting her more than the cold reality of the agreement. In the days that followed, their lives unfolded according to the contract. Breakfasts were eaten at the same table but in silence. Public outings were staged, their hands linked for the cameras, their smiles polished and hollow. At night, she returned to her separate room, untouched, unseen. Yet cracks began to form. She noticed how he always walked on the side of traffic when they crossed the street, shielding her without comment. She noticed how he adjusted his schedule so that she would not have to face his family alone. He never admitted to caring, but his actions betrayed him. The world believed in their perfect union, yet behind the locked gates of the mansion, they were two strangers orbiting each other, bound by rules that grew thinner each day. And still, she could not forget his whisper. "Trust me." The first true test came sooner than she expected. Only 1 week into their marriage, his family hosted a lavish dinner to celebrate the union. The mansion's grand dining hall glittered with candlelight, its long table crowded with relatives, investors, and family friends. Every gaze seemed to dissect her, weighing her worth as if she were an acquisition rather than a bride. She had practiced her smile in the mirror, practiced her posture, practiced the careful way she should hold the wineglass. Still, her hands shook when she set it down, and the soft clink against the plate drew the eyes of the guests. Whispered voices rose at once. One aunt leaned closer to another, her voice dripping with scorn. "She comes from nothing. How can she possibly carry the dignity of this family?" Another relative smirked. "It is clear this marriage was never about love. It is a transaction. Look at her. She does not even know which fork to use." Heat rushed to her face. She fumbled, her mind blank, wishing the floor would open beneath her. She wanted to defend herself, to tell them she was more than her family's debts, more than the ink on a contract. But her voice lodged in her throat. Then, the sound of a chair scraping broke the tension. He rose from his seat. Every conversation stilled as the heir of the family fixed his gaze upon them, his presence commanding silence. "She is my wife," he said firmly, his deep voice cutting through the room, "and she deserves your respect." Gasps rippled down the table. No one had expected him to speak, much less to defend her with such steel in his tone. His family, known for their ruthless judgments, sat stunned. He reached for her hand beneath the table, his grip steady and warm. The small gesture shocked her more than his words. For the first time, she felt protected, not as a pawn, but as someone who mattered. Leaning closer so only she could hear, he whispered the words again. "Trust me." Her chest tightened. This was supposed to be a marriage of convenience. He was supposed to remain cold, detached, untouchable. Yet his hand held hers like an anchor, and his whisper carried a weight that made her question everything she thought she knew about him. The rest of the dinner continued, but she barely tasted the food. Her mind swirled with confusion. His family's eyes still watched her with suspicion, but she no longer felt entirely alone. He had taken her side without hesitation. Later, when the guests departed and the hall emptied, she found herself standing with him in the quiet corridor. She wanted to speak, to thank him, but the words tangled on her tongue. He adjusted his cufflinks casually, as though he had not just defied his entire family. "Do not let them break you," he said, his voice calm. "They feed on weakness. If they sense fear, they will not stop." Her eyes lifted to his. "Why did you defend me?" she asked softly. He met her gaze steadily. "Because you are my wife." It was such a simple statement, yet it struck her deeper than she expected. For the first time, the boundaries of the contract blurred. For the first time, she wondered if behind his composed exterior there was something real, something dangerous to her heart. That night, when she lay awake staring at the ceiling, she replayed every detail, the firmness of his voice, the warmth of his hand, the whisper that still echoed in her mind. "Trust me." It no longer felt like a script. It felt like a beginning. Days turned into weeks, and the rules of their arrangement began to blur. What had once been a cold contract started to feel strangely alive. She noticed it first in the smallest details, details no contract could account for. On a rainy afternoon, as she hurried from the car toward the mansion, she had forgotten her umbrella. The downpour soaked through her dress in seconds, and she shivered on the steps. Then, without a word, he appeared beside her, holding his own coat above her head. She looked up, startled, meeting his steady eyes. He simply said, "Do not catch a cold," before guiding her inside. The coat was heavy on her shoulders, still warm from his body, and for hours afterward, she could not shake the feeling of safety it carried. At dinners, he began to notice her preferences. Without asking, he poured her glass with water instead of wine, knowing she disliked the bitterness. He ordered her favorite dishes before she could speak. When she struggled to reach a high shelf in the library, he quietly placed the book in her hands, without making her feel small. These were not grand gestures, but they unsettled her more than any display of wealth. She had braced herself for distance, for indifference. Instead, she was confronted with a man who, beneath his armor of control, paid attention. But shadows lurked. One evening, at a charity gala, whispers followed her like smoke. His former fiancée had returned from abroad, stunning in a crimson gown, her every move calculated to draw him back into her orbit. She smiled at him with familiarity, speaking of memories that predated the contract marriage. The woman's words were like knives, each designed to remind the bride that she was temporary, replaceable. Her stomach twisted as she stood at his side, forced to wear the mask of a confident wife. Cameras flashed, and she held his arm, her fingers tense. The former fiancé's laughter echoed in her ears, cruel and sweet. Later, in the car ride home, silence stretched between them. She turned to the window, blinking back tears, unwilling to let him see the ache in her chest. He finally spoke, his tone even but firm. "Do not waste energy on her. She thrives on envy. You are my wife, not her." She wanted to believe him, but she also knew the truth. On paper, she was nothing more than a shield, a convenient solution to his family's demands. Her heart warned her not to fall. Yet every time he reached for her hand in public, every time he whispered, "Trust me," her defenses cracked further. One night, as she worked in the study, sketching absent-mindedly to calm her mind, he entered quietly. His gaze fell on her drawings, delicate and precise. "You draw," he said, a hint of surprise in his voice. Embarrassed, she tried to close the sketchbook, but he stopped her gently. "Do not hide it. You have talent." No one had spoken to her like that in years. Not her family, not his relatives, not even her closest friends. His words touched a part of her she had buried, the part that longed to be seen beyond obligations and contracts. When he left the room, she sat trembling, torn between reason and feeling. The contract said one thing, but his actions said another. Was this marriage still fake? Or was it slowly becoming real? The breaking point arrived in the most public way possible. One morning, the tabloids exploded with photographs. Grainy shots of her stepping out of a cafe with a male friend from her past had been twisted into scandalous headlines. "The contract bride already cheating?" the headlines screamed. Commentators filled the airwaves, speculating that their marriage was nothing more than a staged performance. When she saw the newspapers spread across the breakfast table, her hands shook so violently that the cup of tea nearly slipped from her grasp. She tried to explain, her voice trembling. It was nothing. He is just a family friend. We met for 10 minutes, that is all. But he did not answer. He read the article in silence, his expression an impenetrable mask. The quiet was worse than anger. It hollowed her out, convincing her that this was the moment the contract would crumble. That evening, the company hosted a press conference to address a major business deal. She had not planned to attend, but at the last moment, he took her hand and guided her to the stage at his side. The cameras blinded her, reporters shouting questions like arrows. Is it true your wife is unfaithful? Was this marriage arranged only to cover your family's image? Are you planning to divorce? Her heart raced. Every instinct screamed for her to run, to hide from the storm of voices. But he stood firm, his grip around her hand strong and unwavering. Then, into the microphone, he spoke words that silenced the entire hall. My wife is not unfaithful. My wife is not a scandal. She is my partner, and I will not allow her name to be dragged through the mud. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Reporters exchanged stunned glances. He rarely addressed personal matters, yet here he was, defending her with a conviction that sounded nothing like a contract. He pulled her closer, his arm settling protectively around her waist. You can say what you want about me. You can question my business, my decisions, my family. But if you insult her, you insult me. And I do not forgive that. The room erupted with flashing lights. Questions shouted over one another. But in that moment, she heard nothing except the steady beat of his words. She looked up at him, her eyes wide with disbelief. He met her gaze, his voice dropping just enough for her alone. Trust me. The phrase, repeated so often, now carried a new power. It was no longer a whisper to calm her nerves or shield her from scrutiny. It was a declaration, a promise forged under the weight of the world's judgment. That night, back in the mansion, she confronted him, her emotions overflowing. Why did you do that? Why risk your reputation for me? He loosened his tie, his expression unreadable. Because you are my wife, and because I meant it when I said trust me. Ho! Her heart pounded. The line between duty and desire, between contract and commitment, blurred until she could no longer tell where one ended and the other began. For the first time, she allowed herself to wonder if their marriage, built on paper and signatures, was transforming into something real. The illusion of control shattered when the contract itself was exposed. It began with a leak. A confidential document, stamped and signed, appeared on an anonymous blog before being picked up by national media. The clauses were printed in bold letters for the world to see. The marriage shall remain in effect for 2 years. The wife shall participate in public events as required. Emotional involvement is not expected. She stared at the headlines on the glowing screen, her blood turning cold. Her worst fear had come true. What had been whispered in private was now plastered across every news outlet. The world knew she was not truly his bride, but a contractual placeholder. When she entered the mansion's study, he was already there, standing at the window with the contract clutched in his hand. His jaw was tight, his eyes dark with fury. Who leaked this? He demanded, though she could see in his face that the damage was already beyond repair. Tears burned her eyes. They will think I married you only for money. They will think I trapped you. His voice softened for the first time that night. Do not listen to them. You know why this began. We both signed. But that was the wound, was it not? They had signed. And now, all the tender moments, the whispered promises, the public defense, everything risked being reduced to a performance. Nothing more than a calculated act to keep up appearances. His family convened in the grand hall, their accusations cutting like blades. You have humiliated us. This girl has brought scandal. End this farce before it destroys the company. She wanted to fight back, but her throat closed. The whispers from the dinner table returned, sharper than ever. She was a fraud, an intruder, an actress in a role she did not deserve. That night, she packed a small suitcase. As she folded her clothes with trembling hands, her heart ached at the memory of his whisper. Trust me words that had once given her strength but now felt hollow. When he found her at the door, she could not meet his eyes. I cannot do this anymore, she said, her voice breaking. Every look, every word. It feels like a lie. Maybe it always was. He reached for her hand, but she pulled away. For the first time since their wedding night, he looked powerless, as if the empire he had built meant nothing compared to the sight of her slipping away. She stepped into the darkness beyond the gates, leaving behind the mansion, the contract, and the man whose touch had both haunted and healed her. For the first time, they were truly apart. Rain poured down as if the sky itself grieved. She walked quickly along the dimly lit street, suitcase in hand, her gown hemmed damp with water. Every step felt like tearing away a piece of herself. But she could not stay in a house built on signatures and secrecy. She had to leave before her heart betrayed her completely. Headlights cut through the rain. His car stopped sharply beside her, and he stepped out, the storm drenching his suit in seconds. For the first time, the man who always carried himself like unshakable steel looked undone, desperate. "Do not walk away," he said, his voice raw against the downpour. "Not like this." "Dow." She shook her head, clutching the suitcase tighter. "The world knows everything. They were right all along. I was only a contract bride." Her voice cracked, tears mixing with the rain. All those moments, all those whispers, were they just part of the deal? He stepped closer, the water cascading down his face, but he did not care. "No," he said fiercely. "Every moment with you was real. Every time I told you to trust me, I meant it. I never cared about the contract. I cared about you." Number 1. Her chest tightened, torn between believing him and protecting her wounded heart. "Then why did you let it go this far? Why let me think I was nothing more than a pawn?" His hands trembled as he reached for her shoulders. "Because I was afraid. Afraid that if I admitted the truth, I would lose you even sooner. I thought hiding behind the contract would protect me, but all it did was hurt you." The storm raged around them, but in that moment the world seemed to hold its breath. He lowered his forehead to hers, his voice breaking into a whisper, the same words that had bound them from the beginning. "Trust me, just this, once more. Not as a husband by contract, but as a man who loves you." Her heart faltered. The sincerity in his eyes stripped away the walls she had built. The empire, the fortune, the contract, all of it dissolved in the rain, leaving only two souls standing vulnerable before each other. The suitcase slipped from her grip, landing in a shallow puddle with a soft thud. She closed her eyes, leaning into his arms, finally allowing herself to believe. This was no longer about survival, no longer about appearances. This was love revealed at last. The next morning, the storm had passed, but the battle was far from over. The scandal still burned across every newspaper and television screen. The family board had called an emergency meeting, demanding he dissolve the marriage before the company's reputation was destroyed completely. They stood together in the grand hall, facing the elders and shareholders who had gathered like judges waiting for a verdict. Whispers filled the room, sharp and cruel. Some called her an opportunist, others a liar. She lowered her eyes, her heart pounding, ready for him to let her go, in order to protect the empire he had been born to defend. But instead, he stepped forward, his voice steady and commanding. "I will not annul this marriage. I will not discard my wife to appease your pride or the market's gossip. What began as a contract has become something greater, and I will not let any of you strip that away." Gasps rippled through the hall. One of the uncles slammed his hand on the table. "You are risking everything for her. This family will not tolerate such weakness." He turned, his gaze sharp as steel. "You call it weakness. I call it integrity. For years we have built this empire on control, on manipulation, on deals that devoured lives. But I will not build my marriage the same way. She is not a pawn. She is my partner, and I will stand by her." The silence that followed was suffocating, but it was a silence of surrender. No one dared challenge him further. His authority, long rooted in power and wealth, now carried the weight of something even greater: conviction. He turned to her then, in front of them all, and took her hand. "You once asked why I defended you. The answer is simple: because I love you. That is the only truth I will live by from now on." Her eyes widened, tears blurring her vision. For so long, she had doubted, feared, questioned every gesture. But here, in the heart of his empire, surrounded by those who had doubted her most, he had chosen her without hesitation. Slowly, she lifted her chin, meeting the cold eyes of the family who had mocked her. "I may not have been born into wealth, but I know the value of loyalty and kindness. If that makes me unworthy in your eyes, so be it. but I will not apologize for loving him." The words hung in the air, undeniable and fierce. For the first time, the whispers ceased. They walked out of that hall hand in hand, no longer bound by paper, but by something far stronger. The family could not erase their choice, and the world could no longer deny what had been revealed. That night, when the doors of the mansion closed behind them, everything felt changed. It was no longer a gilded cage where she carried the weight of a contract. It was no longer a stage where every smile had to be rehearsed. Tonight, for the first time, the mansion felt like a home. She stood before the tall window of the master's suite, the moonlight spilling across her gown, silver threads gleaming like water. Her reflection in the glass was no longer the frightened bride who had once trembled under a veil. She had walked through humiliation, endured the sting of gossip, faced the cruelty of his family, and now she stood taller, stronger. Most of all, she was no longer alone. The door opened behind her, and his footsteps crossed the room. He had shed his armor of formality, no tie, no jacket, only the man who had chosen her when it mattered most. His gaze held hers, unwavering. For a moment, silence stretched between them, but it was a silence rich with promise instead of doubt. He approached slowly, each step deliberate, until he stood so close she could feel the warmth of his presence. His voice was low, yet every word carried the weight of a vow. "That night at the altar, I whispered for you to trust me. I know I failed you many times since. I hid behind rules and contracts when I should have told you the truth. But tonight, I will not hide anymore. I love you, not as an obligation, not as an arrangement, but as my choice, my only choice." Her throat tightened, tears gathering in her eyes. She remembered the girl she had been nervous, powerless, afraid to even lift her gaze among strangers who judged her. That girl had believed she was only a pawn in his empire. But tonight, standing before him, she realized she had become something else entirely. She was his equal, not by birth or by wealth, but by the strength of the love they had fought to protect. Her voice trembled, but it did not falter. "I trust you, not because you asked me to, but because you proved I could. Every time you stood by me when the world turned against me, every time you defended me when I doubted myself, you showed me who you really are. And I love that man, not the heir, not the title, not the power. I love you." He reached for her hand, threading his fingers through hers, as if sealing a bond stronger than any legal document. His eyes softened, and for the first time since their wedding, she saw not the cold air of a powerful family, but the man who had whispered to her in the middle of a storm, desperate to be believed. He drew her closer, his forehead resting gently against hers, his breath warm on her skin. "Then let us begin again," he whispered. "Not with contracts, not with masks, only with love." Her tears fell freely now, but they were no longer tears of fear or shame. They were tears of release, of joy, of a heart finally allowed to beat without chains. She leaned into him, her arms wrapping around his neck, her lips brushing his with a tenderness that promised forever. The world outside might continue to doubt them, might continue to gossip, but in this room, on this night, none of that mattered. What mattered was the truth they had found in each other. Later, as she lay against his chest, the steady rhythm of his heartbeat beneath her ear, she felt a peace she had never known. No contracts, no signatures, no obligations. Only two souls who had chosen to stay, no matter the cost. And when his lips found her ear once more, he spoke the words that had haunted her since the day they wed. Words that had once been a whisper of uncertainty, but were now a vow of eternity. "Trust me." She smiled through her tears, her answer soft but certain. "Always." What began as a performance had become their truth. What began as a contract had become their love. And what began as a wedding night filled with fear ended at last as the beginning of forever.